Yeah, when I taught this class in person, it'd be a totally different story. I live quite far away from school, so I'd have to wake up like 2 hours before class. But now I'm kind of afforded the option to just wake up like 30 minutes before class, or even more near when class starts. So it takes me a second to wake up. But yeah, so I guess people are still rolling in here, but I guess I can start. So one of the things that we're going to talk about today, I guess, it's a funny theme. I guess we're going to talk about the very, very microscopic and the very, very macroscopic. There's a little bit of just extremely obsessive details about like specific notes, non-harmonic tones in particular. I have like different slides on all of these different tones. But then I was going to talk about some big picture stuff like with binary and ternary forms. So I guess I should start out by saying that I posted the homework based on a suggestion someone made. I actually, on the dictation, I actually labeled the BPM and I added a count in. So for instance, now it actually has a little count in. Whoa. Is that syncopation I hear? I think so. That's some syncopation. So watch out now. Be careful. It's fast and slow. And sometimes it makes it easier to hear it when it's fast because it might just feel really slow. But anyway, you'll get a sense for the pulse based on the metronome two bars beforehand. Hopefully that helps you guys, because I did actually notice based on the students' feedback that depending on your playback configuration, it could just start right away and then you don't really have a sense for the pulse. So no problem there. There's actually there's three parts to this homework. It's basically, it's like this sort of book stuff. I actually gave you lots of hints because this became quite subjective during certain spots. I gotta say something really quickly. I remember last time I was mentioning how like one part of the homework could be considered subjective. It was really only one question that was subjective. All the other questions were pretty objective. Whereas on this one, there are a few where multiple answers are okay, but I tried to like give you clues about the answer. And I actually disagreed with what they wrote here. So I actually wrote my own answer and you don't have to fill that one out. But yeah, so basically it should hopefully help you because it's not multiple choice, but I'm trying to kind of help you find the right definition because there are a lot of definitions. So just help you stay on the right track. Hint, some of these are directly on the OneNote, like this one. The answer is on the OneNote. Let's see. And then the second part is basically a few chords to analyze, a few solfeggios to write in, and a few chords to analyze, and dictation. And then, last but not least but not last, you have this small form right here, and you just have to basically kind of write what form it is and be descriptive, like use like 5 words or at least 3 words to describe this. You could describe this in 3 words. And yeah, that's that. So without further ado, I guess, I guess I should say that, yeah, the files are there. There's a Sibelius 8 file as well as the regular file. Oh, music XML. I didn't export that, but I could export that as well. If you need that, just remind me in case I forget. Yeah, so without further ado, I guess we could start getting to the nitty-gritty. So let me move this stuff around in a sensible way. I'm recording right now, right? Okay, cool. All right, so just to kind of recap about chord tones and, non-harmonic tones, it's basically where the notes in the melody don't match the chord that is harmonized with it. So for instance, this is Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and I've shown you basically all the incidences where the note in the melody actually matches the chord underneath it. So all of these are actually harmonic tones in the way that this was arranged in this particular manner. It doesn't have to be that though. Like for instance, I made up another little melody, and in this particular instance, there are actually notes here in the melody, here and here and here, where the notes in the melody don't match the chord that harmonizes it. So that's basically what a non-harmonic tone is. And then there's lots of like specific definitions. Now again, this is, to be perfectly frank, this is something that I often forget the definitions of. I haven't now because I'm expected to teach this, and the syllabus and the UCSD course curriculum expects coverage of this. But I guess the takeaway I want you to have with all this stuff is just, I hope this gets you to think critically about certain melodic devices, whether or not like you exactly remember all these definitions or remember the exact names for all these things is less significant than remembering how these things function. And this kind of goes along the idea that like a lot of great musicians don't know how to read music, but they still like know how to use all of the tools at their disposal. So I'm just trying to expose you to tools, and I guess the UCSD is as well. But for the sake of this week, you're going to have to be pretty diligent and vigilant in identifying all of these different notes. And you know, to be honest, I don't think I'm going to forget this stuff, because once you do this over and over again, like I had to do this when I was in school, and then for a lot of theory classes, I didn't have to do this again, but then I had to teach it on like 2 occasions, and you know, it sticks pretty much the more you do it. But I'm always thinking about these devices, whether or not I know the exact names of them. So anyway, the first kind of device that I want to talk about are neighbor tones, or auxiliary tones, and embellishing tones. Those are other names for these devices. And there are a number of them. And basically the basic gist of neighbor tones is that they're one step away from the chord tone. And they may also be called, oh, I already said that. They may be called auxiliary tones or embellishing tones, okay? So what we have here, these are my initials. No, these are my initials, but what we have here are neighboring tones. And, or we have a neighboring tone, I should say. And this is an upper neighbor tone because the note steps up to a non-chord tone and returns back to the same note. So that's an interesting device right there. I think in a lot of these examples, you're starting basically with a C major chord in the first measure and then a C major chord in the second measure. And you can see how this A doesn't fit in with the C major chord, right? And it's basically you're climbing stepwise up to a note above that chord, and then you're returning back down. So in that case, it's not just a neighbor tone, it's an upper neighbor, okay? So those of you living in apartments might identify with this kind of neighbor tone. All right, so now we have lower neighbor tones. A lower neighbor tone is when a note steps down to a non-chord tone and then returns back to the same note. And actually, I had to make this one myself, but actually the font is kind of similar. Yeah, so you have a C major chord here, you have a C major chord here. This G fits in with the C major chord, but this F does not. It's a non-chord tone. In this particular case, it's a neighbor tone because it's stepping down and then stepping back up. And what do you have? You have a lower neighbor tone. Fascinating, right? Great stuff. Okay, so then there's this idea of having an accented neighbor tone. Okay, so an accented neighbor tone is a neighbor tone that occurs on the downbeat of a chord, and it's an accented neighbor tone. So this is something that I think is significant. Most of the time, or a lot of the time, the dissonant non-harmonic tones occur in between the chords. So for instance, you have this. Right? You have a chord tone, then you have a dissonant non-harmonic tone, and then you return back to a consonant chord tone. But you know, for added emphasis, you might actually have a dissonance on a downbeat. So you have a chord tone, you have something moving, you have the melody moving by some sort of neighbor motion. And right, interesting, right? So in this particular case, What's interesting about this is the neighbor tone actually occurs on the chord. And this could be a non-harmonic tone, or it could be a chord tone. There's nothing necessarily, there are situations where neighbor tones and passing tones are consonant. And I can give you an example of that. Uh-oh. Okay, good. All right. Okay. So what I mean by neighbor tones being consonant and dissonant is the following. It's not registering anything. Excuse me, let me restart the software. I guess I could explain this while the software is starting. So actually what's happening in this particular incident, if you think about it one way, is that you have an A minor chord going to a G major chord, sorry, to go into a C major chord. Because what you have is the C, E, A, which is basically a snowman of the sort that it's A minor. And then what you have is C major. So you could think about it this way as well. That is to say, sometimes neighbor tones will create chords that are not like suspension chords, or chords that don't feel like they totally need to resolve necessarily. So I guess to elaborate on that a little bit, I think I pretty much said what I need to say, but I guess I can show you it this way. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is basically have, right, basically what I have is a C major scale, and I'm kind of considering all of these notes against, all these melody notes against the chord in the bass clef. And what you have here is you have a C major chord if I take this note right here. Now this right here, I mean, exempting, so this is, I got to make one distinction. In the classical world, ninth chords and 13th chords and 11th chords aren't very common for whatever reason. So I mean, in a jazz world, you could actually call this, if you combine this melody note with this chord, well, you could actually call this, oh, there we go. Sorry, my shortcuts are being weird. You could call this a C major, like add 9, right? So you have a C major chord, and then you're adding a 9, right? But the expectation in classical music is when you have something like this, is that it's going to do something like this. Where you have basically a non-harmonic tone for that, it doesn't fit well with the triad underneath, and then it resolves down, okay? So I guess one big thing about classical music is that generally 9th chords, 11th chords, and 13th chords don't feel that resolved. So they're treated in a way where they're often resolved on subsequent beats. Whereas in jazz, 9th, 11th, and 13th are stable chords. They don't need any resolution. You could just have, right? You can have stuff like that where you have a 9th and you're not like, you don't have to go, right? That's one thing I want to say. So from an analysis standpoint, you might be wondering, well, there's a lot of situations as we look through these non-chord tones where you're like, I wonder how I would describe that chord in jazz language. And there are ways to describe that chord, these chords in jazz language, but for the sake of these exercises, the real point of them, the main point of them, is to describe them as melodic devices. That you're basically considering the top voice as a melody against the other 3 voices. So you're kind of constructing a chord out of the bottom 3 voices, and the top voice is just kind of a melody. And so I guess what I could say about that is, earlier I was talking about how chords could result from, like, chords that aren't sus chords could result. So for instance, like if I put this in there, if this was the top note, this is a really weird chord, but there's a tendency for this F to resolve to E. So for instance, right? This is kind of a sus chord. I just made that song up. No, I'm just kidding. That's Don't Stop Believing by Journey. So right here, you have this F, right? It has this tendency to want to desperately resolve down to an E. And incidentally, this really doesn't sound good on its own accord. Well, on a chord, right? So it really has a tendency to want to resolve. Even a jazz player would probably have trouble using this particular voicing in a stable manner, right? For one thing, it has that minor ninth. But there are situations, like in the example, where the non-harmonic tone actually makes something a little more pleasant. Or sorry, the neighbor tone makes something that's a little more pleasant sounding. Right? So I guess when you're thinking about non-harmonic tones, you kind of have to decide which harmony it's non-harmonic with. Like, you're kind of deciding that this A is non-harmonic with a C major chord, right? It's harmonic with an A minor chord, but it's not harmonic with a C major chord. And all this clarification is really because of this feature that this non-harmonic tone actually happens on a strong beat, which is sort of rarer in terms of the examples. But it's sort of easy to see in this example, for instance, that this is clearly like the non-harmonic tone because it doesn't happen with the chord. It happens like on an offbeat. So anyway, if you have any questions about that, let me know. I know it's a little kind of giving you some different perspectives on this, but hopefully I'm not confusing you. I guess ultimately the takeaway is just look at the top voice and think about how the top voice is functioning along with the main portions of the chord, the remainder of the chord. So I guess I can write that down. Ooh, where am I going to write this down? Think about how the top voice functions against the remainder of the chord. I have to be careful about formatting this because I have some weird, if I just press spacebar, for instance, well, actually that time it wasn't so bad. Sometimes it'll move my pictures around, so yeah, like that. Okay, well, I'll think about where I'm going to put this, but okay, so lower neighbors, upper neighbors makes sense, right? Accented neighbors, right? You see this motion of moving up and moving back down. In this particular scenario, the movement, the apex of this motion occurs on a chord tone, with a chord, simultaneously with a chord. Okay, so now there's this thing called a neighbor group, which is also called cambiata, changing tones, changing notes, double neighboring tones, or a neighbor group. You might wonder why so many names. It's because a lot of theorists disagree on this, and in fact, there's even one more species of this, which I won't explain to you. And sometimes people use these terms to disambiguate one of these types of neighbor groups from another type of neighbor group. But for the sake of what we're going to learn right now, we're just going to focus on this one neighbor group. And a neighbor group really has two non-harmonic tones in succession. You basically have an upper neighbor skipping down to the lower neighbor back to the chord tone, right? So this E goes up, and then after that, the D is like the lower neighbor of the E, right? And then it goes back up. It's kind of a nice little device, right? you have to be careful with your treatment of dissonance and non-harmonic tones. So this just happens to work out really nicely that they've kind of defined it as a thing in music theory, because composers use it all the time, because it's very rare that you can have two dissonances in a row and for something to sound good. And this is just one of those cases. And the reason it sounds good is because you're kind of still centered around the chord tone that the neighbors are kind of surrounding. So for instance, this F is the upper neighbor, this D is the lower neighbor. Even though you're skipping between two non-chord tones, you still have the sensation that everything is in relation to this chord tone, which is E. Okay. So another really important, I guess, big picture reason why it's good to study this stuff is because the more you study this, these kind of features, the more you understand how to contextualize chord tones against non-chord tones, which is useful for your analysis. You might erroneously choose notes that aren't in the chord as part of the chord analysis that you're doing. So the more of these kind of examples you see of non-chord tones, the better and more informed your analysis of actual chords will be, because you'll see how like composers can use devices that are not harmonic in a composition. That's why, you know, for your homework, it might not be so obvious some of these, how to segment some of this stuff. So I tried, you know, especially for the last, well, maybe not for the last homework, I can't remember right now, but that's why like I'll do things like circle things to be like, oh yeah, this is the harmony that we're really going towards, and this is like the non-harmonic incident at the time, right? Things like that. So as you get better at understanding non-harmonic tones, you'll be able to segment your music in a more analytically salient way. Okay, so neighbor group. Okay, man, these neighbors really need to practice social distancing. All right, so now we have the appoggiatura, right? Oh, I have a lot of stuff written here because this book, there's so many weird definitions. And this book has like a definition that I don't like, but it's technically valid. So we have to kind of be clear about this. An appoggiatura. The classic definition, in the classic definition. Let's see, someone wrote something in the chat. Let me just keep my chat window open. The problem is I'm running out of screen real estate. That is a monster of a word. Oh, yes, it is. And you know what? There's actually a corollary word called the accacciatura. So yeah, it's a fun thing to say. So the appoggiatura, we're gonna actually talk about it later as well. So, you know, I know you're waiting in anticipation right now as I talk about it, but let's see. We're gonna talk about anticipation later. Appoggiatura, the classic definition is that it's a non-harmonic tone that appears with the chord on the strong beat. Okay? So for instance, okay, that kind of reminds me of, imagine an appoggiatura in your music. Okay. Anyway, yeah, so Imagine by John Lennon, I guess, has a little bit of an appoggiatura. Fun fact. So what do we have here? We have basically a chord tone that, sorry, we have a non-harmonic tone on a strong beat. And the classic definition, actually, the non-chord tone is approached by a skip, by a leap. And then it resolves in the opposite direction. So if it skips up, it steps down. Okay? So I remember a while back, one of the students actually asked me about difficulties with leaps in their music, and they were leaping to a dissonance. And I suggested resolving down by step. This is a principle that goes back to the Middle Ages. If you leap to a dissonance, resolve down by step. Or resolve in the opposite direction by step. So if you leap down, resolve up by step. If you leap up, resolve down by step. So in appoggiatura, you're basically leaping to a non-chord tone on a strong beat, and then you're resolving down by step. Man, this is like theorists disagree about this, or it's developed too much of a vague connotation because there's actually a lot of overlap in the homework. But just understand what these things are. This is why definitions there's a folly in the definition in the actual labeling of this, because it's more important just to know what these things are by feel, right? The fact that John Lennon does this, you can imagine this as an imagined tone. I don't know.
Sorry, what do you mean by strong beat and downbeat, like for the accent
Okay,
versus this?
so strong beat, I'm really referring to well, I guess downbeat, I'm referring to the first beat of each measure. So this right here is the downbeat, and this right here is the downbeat. Strong beat refers to the time signature itself. So for instance, taking a slight detour, do I have this somewhere? Maybe this might be something that I don't have. I think I have it somewhere. Um, that's surprising to me. Give me one sec. I guess it's worth talking about this because, well, why not make it? So I guess certain time signatures have certain characteristics. So if we're in the time signature, whoopsie. If we're in the time signature of 4/4, what you'll expect actually, obviously there's 4 beats in the measure. And oh, this is the problem with having all these Zoom windows, like mine. Okay, so here's the accent, and here is a weaker beat. So this is how 4/4 is notated a lot in terms of accent. There's a strong beat on beat 1, and then there's a weak beat on beat 3. 3/4 basically has, pardon me, has a strong beat on beat 1. 2/4 has just a strong beat on beat 1. So these are the simple time signatures. But common to all of them is that the downbeat is the first measure of the measure. But a strong beat is really an incidence. It's kind of dependent on each time signature. But in this case, I guess in the case of your homework too, I think most of the time the strong beat that's being asked to analyze is the downbeat, so it makes your analysis a little bit easier. I could go on, like different, compound time signatures have a different feel as well. So just as a recap, I guess we need to do some rhythm anyway. So
if you are looking at a chord, then the downbeat is the root of that chord?
no, it has nothing to do with the position of the chord. It has to do with the position of time you're in. So it's not the root of the chord. It's really the position in the measure. It's the beat position essentially. The downbeat is the first beat of the measure, right? Because like for instance, you said the root of the chord, but I could have the root. I could have a chord here, but this has nothing to do with the downbeat. The downbeat happens on beat 1 of each measure.
Yeah, so like if it's a chord to start, the chord is like the first beat of the measure, then the whole chord you're saying is the downbeat.
Absolutely, yeah. If the chord occupies, let me shut the door really quickly. It's getting kind of loud. That didn't help. The landscapers are outside. Yeah, if there's a chord at the very first measure, oh, not that one. Yeah, the first measure, the chord occupies the downbeat. And then going along with this idea a little bit further, because I did kind of give you this on your midterms last quarter, these other time signatures, these compound time signatures, you might have something like this, right? Or even yet something like this. I think actually this one has that. Right? It inherits some of the, yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you recall the difference between complex time signatures and compound and non-compound, let me quickly do this. This will kind of clarify it very, very simply. I have to do a little bit of shifting. I'm trying to, whoops. What's the shortcut? Oh, there we go. That's select system passage in Sibelius. Okay. Nope. Okay. So I guess what I'm trying to illustrate over here, if you guys remember, is in simple duple meter, simple meters. Okay. So what we have is a simple quadruple meter. And then over here we have a simple triple meter. And then we have a simple duple meter. Over here we have the compound meters. No, complex. Compound? I think it's compound. Yes, compound. So what we have here is the compound quadruple meter. Then we have the compound triple meter. And then we have the compound duple meter. Okay? This is a trip down memory lane. Let me save this really quickly because this is definitely worth putting on the OneNote. Simple and compound meters. Okay, so just recalling these different time signatures, in simple meters, you basically have either 4 beats, 3 beats, 2 beats per measure. And it's called quadruple or triple or duple based on how many beats there are. So if there are 4 beats in the measure, it's a simple quadruple meter. If there's 3 beats, it's a simple triple meter. And if it's 2 beats, it's a simple duple meter. And you can see these accents for each of these simple meters. Now, compound meters basically have the same number of big beats as the descriptive term that accompanies it, like quadruple would have 4 big beats, triple would have 3 big beats, and duple would have 2 big beats. The compound refers to the fact that you're basically taking each of these simple meters and you're subdividing each of the beats into 3. So for instance, in 12/8, you still have 4 big beats by virtue of the fact that I have an accent here, a weaker accent here, a strong accent here, and then a weaker accent here, right? In fact, I mean, I guess you could, yeah, you could say that, right? But you're just basically taking these 4 beats and you're subdividing them by 3. Over here, the difference between simple triple meter and compound triple is you're taking the 3 beats of simple triple meter and you're dividing each of them by 3. So you're getting 9, 8, right?
So every beat that's not marked here is a weak beat?
Yes, every beat that's not, like, for instance, right here, yeah. In fact, there's different gradations of weakness and strongness. So for instance, technically this beat is weaker than this beat. Because if you recall, if you look at simple quadruple meter, the first beat is stronger than the third beat, right? So in compound quadruple meter, the first beat will still be stronger than this beat. So it might be a little bit redundant. You know, for instance, just to be consistent with what I have above, I'll do this. I mean, the idea is you're going to lightly accent these beats anyway, these smaller beats. I mean, the first, you're gonna emphasize each of the groupings of three, because they kind of make they kind of define the bigger beats. So there's going to be a shorter, there's going to be sort of a punctuation point at the beginnings of each of these groupings of three. But the biggest punctuation points, the biggest difference in punctuation will occur between beat 1 and beat 3 in compound quadruple, because big beat 1 is accented in simple quadruple meter. Correspondingly, it's accented in compound quadruple meter. And big beat 3 is accented in simple quadruple meter. So big beat 3 is also accented in compound quadruple meter.
So, and what's the difference between the markings?
So this marking right here is a tenuto, and it has multiple meanings. But one of the meanings it has is that it could mean a weaker accent. So anyway, so the idea of strong beat and weak beat has this following connotation. It kind of differs depending on which paradigm you're in, but it's sort of similar. So for instance, if I'm talking about a strong beat in 4/4, I'm really describing these beats, right? In 3/4, I would be describing this beat. In 2/4, I'd be describing this beat. In compound meters, I'd be describing this beat and this beat, this beat, or this beat. Now here's one other aspect of this though. You could also, there could be situations where this happens, right? Whoops. So let's see really quickly. So in this particular situation, even though like metrically speaking, this is the strongest beat and this is like the strong beat, there's another term that I use also, which is called big beats. Big beats really refer to the number of beats in the meter. So for instance, 3/4 has 3 big beats, right? It has 3 beats. Just like compound triple meter also has 3 big beats, it's just synonymous, right? So, but by calling it like a big beat, it kind of draws attention to the fact that you could actually have, there are more significant points in the meter, which might sound obvious to you, but I guess when I broke this up like this, you can see what I mean. So for instance, what I did here is I actually took chords and I placed them at the beginning of each big beat. But then on the off beats, I actually, the offbeat subdivisions, I actually put non-chord tones in, right? So this is something you're gonna see in music a lot. So this is another example of in the real world music that you're gonna see, especially for your homework, you're gonna see examples like this, where you're gonna see a chord tone on a strong beat, or you're gonna see a chord on a strong beat, and then you're gonna see an offbeat, like an offbeat eighth note or something, that is where the non-chord tone exists. Because this is a weaker beat relative to this, you would agree, right? Because like the more you subdivide, the more you can reveal more degrees of weak beats. So for in this instance, I have 3/4, right? And technically, right? Technically, this is the stronger beat than this, right? And this is also a stronger beat than this, correct? But the power of subdivision says that actually this is actually a stronger beat than this. You know what I mean? And similarly, this second big beat is a stronger beat than its offbeat eighth note beat. And this third big beat is a stronger beat than its offbeat eighth note. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's a lot, when trying to figure this stuff out, there's an aspect of relative framework in that you're trying to discover it's all relative, right? You're trying to find a strong beat in relation to a weaker beat, okay? So if this is the kind of level at which activity is happening, if the activity looks like this, it's not necessarily useful to think, oh, this is the strong beat and we don't have to worry about these beats. The analysis wouldn't work, right? In this particular case, the most suitable analysis would be like, okay, this subdivision is like more important than this subdivision. It's a stronger beat than this beat, and this beat is stronger than this beat, and this beat is stronger than this beat, right? So it's context dependent. That's the thing about rhythm. I think this becomes clear when you're actually doing the work, but hopefully that illuminates what you're talking about. Ooh, there's lots of questions in the chat. But Tate, does that kind of address your question or address your questions?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. Rhythm is tricky. You can stub your toe on it by doing it or by trying to explain it. It's bizarre and beautiful. So let me go back and, according to Google, it's actually spelled appoggiatura. Thank you for catching that. I've definitely probably spelled that wrong. Let me go back to the chord tones section. And it's under chords. Appoggiatura. Wow, that's amazing. You know, my spelling, this competitive speller in me is getting, it's being brought out right now. I'm like, man, how did I miss that? How did I spell that wrong? Well, it's okay. You're really leaving me in suspension. So what differentiates this from accented? Oh, okay. So actually on your homework, I actually allow multiple answers. There's an overlap in terminology. So Stephen, when you basically said what differentiates this chord from being a suspension chord, a suspended chord, is that what you're saying? Oh, incidentally, if you can't, this might apply to a lot of you. If you can't, you have to press spacebar to talk in. You have to hold spacebar to talk in. So I don't know if Steve.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, cool. I was wondering actually why how the appoggiatura differentiates from the accented neighbors, because it seems similar to me that it like takes place basically as a neighboring tone on the strong beat.
Okay, so the classic definition has a great answer for this. The non-classical definition doesn't have a great answer. So I'll give you an example of how the classical definition gives you a great answer. Notice how there's a skip here and there's a step here. So the classical definition accommodates this by saying if the accented passing tone or the accented non-harmonic tone is approached by skip in one direction and a step in the opposite direction, then it's an appoggiatura. That's the classic definition. And that by its own accord differentiates an appoggiatura from an accented neighbor tone, for instance, right?
That makes sense.
But this is the confusing thing about appoggiaturas, and just these terms in general, is that people have multiple terms, and it drives you mad. So, for instance, this is a characteristic accented passing tone, where basically you have a dissonance on a downbeat. Okay. All right, you have a dissonance on a downbeat, and then it resolves down by step. Right, this is characteristic appoggiatura, right? Ah, look at this. This is great. This shows you another beat. So in this particular case, this is what I was explaining earlier. This is one of the big beats of the measure. It's not the strongest beat of the measure, but relative to this subdivision, this beat is stronger than this subdivision. So the resolution actually occurs. Oh, thank you. Salad for my mom. All right, great. Great. So what we have is 7/6, right? That probably is meaningless to you. This is actually lifted from a counterpoint class I'm teaching, but basically sevenths tend to be dissonant intervals and sixths tend to be consonant intervals. And it just so happens that if you tried to make a chord out of this, you would find that to be the case in certain regards. But anyway, this is all to say that this is indeed, if you did actually see a chord underneath this accompanying this, you would find that this is a characteristic appoggiatura because you have a leap preceding the accented non-harmonic tone and then a step in the opposite direction. Oh, not cut fruit, cut vegetables, but tomatoes are fruit, so I guess there's some cut fruit in there. So you have a step in the opposite direction. Okay, so now this is another maddening thing. So I guess you could have an unaccented appoggiatura where basically you have the non-harmonic tone on a weak beat, and then you still resolve by step in the opposite direction. Fun, right? Look at all these definitions. As if that wasn't confusing enough. This really drove me mad as I was trying to prepare homework for this. It can also be, this could also be an appoggiatura. According to the homework, this is an appoggiatura. In fact, this is directly from your homework. So I guess you got one of the answers correct if you were paying attention. But I would argue that this could also be like an accented passing tone, which is something that we haven't actually talked about yet, but should hopefully make sense. I don't want to stub my toe too much. This is, I guess I'll show you what this sounds like. You basically have a non-chord tone on a downbeat, a non-harmonic tone on a downbeat, and then it resolves up. So this is an appoggiatura as well. I guess one thing to keep in mind about appoggiaturas is that I don't mind if you call one thing, especially for the appoggiatura questions. I've already told the TAs that if you call it an appoggiatura, an accented neighbor, accented passing tone, I won't mark you wrong, because there is some weird overlap to it, because this totally disagrees with the classic definition of appoggiatura. What's even more maddening is that right here, you actually have, whoops. I'm playing this rhythm wrong, I apologize. Okay. So what you have here, this is also an appoggiatura. And I'll just show you what an unaccented passing tone is really quickly, or an accented passing tone. It's basically you have a non-chord tone on a strong beat, and it resolves to a chord tone on the subsequent beat. That's an accented passing tone. Now, here's the thing about this. That looks exactly like this. Because here's another confusing thing about appoggiaturas. Sometimes they're represented as grace notes. So for instance, when you see an appoggiatura like this in the music, if you see basically a grace note, basically, I mean, not a grace note, basically like an ornamented quarter note followed by tied in this way. I guess you could call it a grace note, but that mixed definitions for that. But the way you interpret that is basically by playing this first one on the downbeat and playing the actual main part of the note on the second half of the beat. Yeah, what Steven said, what's confusing to me was the lack of a jump. Or wait, are we looking at different examples? No, we're still looking at appoggiatura. This is very confusing, but I wanted to give you the truth. I don't want to give you the half-truth. I could have said, the book said this, but actually the book doesn't give you the most standard definition. So I guess I just wanted to give you the truth, guys. The truth is not so pretty when it comes to appoggiaturas. There's all kinds of conflicting definitions on appoggiaturas. Payon said, I think since the last two Ds of the end of the first measure are also non-harmonic, the contour of an appoggiatura is maintained. Which part are you talking about, Payon?
Um, the one in B flat.
This one right here? Where we start? I can't hear you.
The one above that.
Oh yeah, the C sharps. Yeah, in this case, the contour of the appoggiatura is maintained because you're stepping down and then you're resolving by step. You're moving down and you're resolving by step in the other direction, right? But in this case, the contour is not maintained, right? Because you actually see three notes moving in the same direction, right?
Yes.
So anyway, this is precisely why I gave you so many, like, it's like a crossword puzzle. I gave you a lot of different things on the homework. Basically, like, if I open up the homework for you, you're going to see lots of little hints. This note does not fit into the G major chord at this exact moment, but it fits into the C major chord during the following. So you're going to be prompted in a way that hopefully gets you the right answer. So I apologize. I really prepared a lot for this, to talk about this. It's just confusing and there's lots of different definitions, but I want to give you the truth. An appoggiatura is, the most characteristic definition of appoggiatura is this. You have a non-harmonic tone on a downbeat, and it's preceded by a leap, and it's approached by a leap, and then it's resulted with a step in the opposite direction. Okay, I gotta leave appoggiaturas, guys. Sorry, this is driving me mad. All right, escape tones. An escape tone is a non-harmonic tone that steps away from a chord tone, then returns by skip to a note that is that is in the next chord. So yeah, the non-harmonic tone, the escape tone, moves in the opposite direction from the two main tones. So you have something like this. So notice how this is the non-chord tone, and it actually moves in the opposite direction. And then it moves back, it jumps back in the opposite direction to a note that's a chord tone. Actually, let me just be updated on the chat really quickly. There's a lot of stuff here. Man, thank you. Okay. So is there a system of strong and weak beats for the beats as well as the divisions? I guess anytime you're subdividing, the first subdivision is stronger than the second subdivision. So like, for instance, you're subdividing this quarter note into 2/8 notes. This subdivision is stronger than this subdivision, right? I wish my mom was here to bring me salad. Well, thank you, yeah. I'm gonna eat this, I'm gonna wish the same thing, and not too long from now. I think the chord tone is the E flat and the C sharp is a skip down. The C sharp resolves up a step. Let's see what we're talking about. Sorry, going back into the ring of fire right now. Yeah, okay, well, let's not talk about this anymore. Let's move to the escape tone. I see what you're saying. It's confusing because it's padded by all these non-chord tones. Yeah, I guess what Peihan was saying was that if you actually consider this E flat as the chord tone, then you're actually jumping down by skip to this non-chord tone, and then you're moving up by step, which is valid. However, the reason I didn't even think of that is because I knew about this other one where it totally is violated by movement in the same direction. But anyway, I guess what I'll say about this is this. When the notes are represented as grace notes, or I guess a general term for this is grace note. I'm going to really stub my toe on this during this lecture because of all the different terminology. I guess the appoggiatura manifests more like this, in this manner, where you actually have this situation arise where you can actually have three notes in a row that are moving in the same direction. But when the appoggiatura is like a feature that you're analyzing in the music, I guess it often does have this contour of moving by skip and then stepping in the opposite direction. So I'm actually very pleased that we actually did find a way that this in fact does satisfy the definition of appoggiatura. Skip and then step in the opposite direction. Okay, escape tones. You basically have a chord. You're moving to a non-chord tone that moves above it most of the time. And then you're skipping back down to a chord, right? So you have this. Pretty straightforward, right? All right, great. Passing motion. It involves three notes moving by step in the same direction. The middle note is dissonant, and it's called the passing tone. So right here, what we have is an unaccented passing tone. And this is the classic passing tone. Basically, we have a stronger beat, and then we have a weaker beat where the non-harmonic tone exists. And then we have a stronger beat where the chord basically exists in its entirety, consisting fully of harmonic tones. The accented passing tone example, we were just talking about this. I guess you could, from some definitions, call this an appoggiatura if it's grace noted that way. But it's if the dissonant passing tone appears on the downbeat of a chord. Okay? It's known as an accented passing tone. Chromatic passing tone. And this is if the passing tone is a chromatic note. Okay, so you have something like this. It's this note right here. That note does not exist in the key at all. So it's more strikingly obvious that it's not part of the underlying harmony. Okay, great. Chromatic passing tones. Yippee. Pedal points. A pedal point is a note, typically in a bass, which is held for an extended time while the other notes and harmonies change around it. So you might have something like this. Right? So the other harmonies are kind of changing around what I was just playing, but this note right here is basically holding an anchor. And it kind of sounds nice. It's kind of like a drone tone. Right? So that's a pedal point. Ostinato. It's a persistently repeated note or pattern. Okay, so what you have is here. That's an ostinato. That's a repeated note, but you can have an ostinato like this. I'm basically repeating that same figure over and over and over again, and I'm not changing it to a different key area. I'm just basically repeating it in that same exact key area, right? That's an ostinato. Okay. Oh man, there's a lot of slides. Gosh, I just want this part of class to be over. No, I don't. I enjoy it, but I dislike all of the ambiguities that can result from it because I'm kind of a clear-cut kind of person. Okay, suspensions, anticipations, retardations. Now, this family of non-harmonic tones is characterized by extending a pitch in time, either by a single repetition of the pitch or the lengthening of a pitch using a tie. So for instance, anticipations, you're kind of repeating a pitch. You're kind of anticipating the note before it actually arrives. So for instance, this non-chord tone is not a chord tone at this point in time, but when it's restruck, it's actually a chord tone. Pretty cool, huh? These are actually much less ambiguous. I should be kinder to this part of music theory. I think the appoggiatura is the only thing that bothers me. But I'm really glad Pehan made that comment. I have a little more faith. The author made a mistake, so I didn't completely trust the author, but I gained some respect for the author. For one, I mean, I've been referring to many different authors, but for the sake of the homework, author. Anyway, anticipation. You have a note. This chord tone, this non-harmonic tone doesn't fit with the chord at this particular moment in time, but anticipates the next chord, and this note is repeated and it fits the next chord. Right? Interesting, right? Anticipation. It's basically a note of the chord played early. Suspension. So a suspension keeps the same note from before and then steps downward. And it's tied over from the preceding note. So for instance, so the idea is this note right here is actually preparing the suspension. It's actually the preparation of the suspension. It's the note that's being tied. And then this is the note that's being tied over. And it ultimately, the moment in time right here where the note has been tied over, where it doesn't fit into the chord at this particular moment in time, is when it's a suspension. And that's where it desperately wants to resolve down, right? So really listen for the top note. This really wants to resolve down, right? It wants to look more like a snowman. We've talked about suspensions in other contexts, right? We've talked about them in terms of jazz chords and how basically there's this want for like the non-snowman looking note to kind of resolve to a note that's in the snowman. The idea though in classical music is that the suspension is often, the suspended note is often prepared. So for instance, that's what this preparation refers to. You usually just don't have a suspension come out of nowhere. You have the suspended note prepared beforehand. So for instance, it's kind of the opposite of anticipation. This note worked well during this chord, but this note doesn't work well for this chord, right? So you have this. This G worked just fine. This boxed square G note worked just fine for this particular note, right? For this particular chord. But now this G doesn't work so well for this chord, right? So then it resolves downwards, okay? Let's look at anticipation one more time, just to kind of think about how this is the inverse, right? This F doesn't work so well for this chord, but it works really well for this chord, right? That's an anticipation. So the anticipated note, right? The suspended note is basically, yeah, this is the opposite, because what you have here, this note, this G works really well for this chord. It's being held over. This is a preparation. It's preparing the suspension that occurs on the next beat, and it resolves down. Okay? So suspensions are, by classic definition, always prepared. They're always tied into, okay? Then there's this idea of re-articulated suspension. And that basically it's the idea that you have a suspension and you have a preparation and suspension, but the preparation isn't tied into the suspension. You're basically re-articulating it. So for instance, if you have this, right here, this note is the preparation. And this note right here, I'm just going to call it prep. Looks like preb. And this note right here is the suspension. Right here, this is the prep, and this is the sus, right? So the idea is, in the first situation, you have the suspension tied into and prepared ahead of time. Whereas in the second example, it's re-articulated, right? That is to say that yeah, the preparation isn't tied into the suspension. So in this case, which is actually directly on your homework again, because this is confusing, I want to help you guys a little bit. Okay. So this right here is, what should we say? This is a rearticulated suspension. Good stuff, right? Oh, one new message. So this is like the opposite of an appoggiatura now. I see what you mean now. Actually, don't. I don't remember the context in which that was said, but oh, that was in reference to the escape. Okay, great. Okay, what do we have here? Suspension chain. So you can actually chain suspensions, and you have this nice little pleasant syncopation that arises. So there's a lot I could say about this, but it's basically, here's the suspension moment, here's the preparation moment, here's the suspension moment. And I guess in some ways the preparation is the resolution, right? You're both resolving the suspension down, but it's also preparing for the next suspension, right? So then you have another preparation / resolution, right? And then you have another suspension right here. And then you have a nice little resolution. And there's no preparation here because this isn't preparing another suspension, right? Here you have a preparation, and there's no resolution here because there's nothing that it resolved from. It's just preparing the suspension. This is suspended, it both resolves, but it's also preparing the next suspension. Now it's suspended, this note, and then it resolves down. It's resolved, but it's also preparing the next suspension. And the suspension resolves. This is a really cool thing, actually. This is something I recommend you kind of do in your own music. This is a powerful construct that is, you know, it's absurd to spend such little time on this concept, but this is a survey of sorts. You know, when you take counterpoint, you'll spend weeks just working out examples where you practice doing these exact exercises. So anyway, just know that this exists, and it's a thing you can do. Retardation. Now, retardation is the opposite of a suspension. Suspensions, well, no. It's different from a suspension in that a suspension resolves downwards and a retardation resolves upwards. So you have, okay? So you have retardation. If this was suspension, this D would resolve down. Right? Okay, so now we'll talk about some ornaments or embellishments. So a trill alternates between a written note and a neighbor tone. And a trill can be interpreted several different ways, and that's dependent on the historical period of the music. So remember, a neighbor tone can also be called an auxiliary tone or an embellishing tone. So a trill can actually begin on the embellishing tone. So you could have, right? You can have that. So I wrote these as neighbor tones, right? Or you could actually have the trills begin on the written tone and go up to the neighbor tone. I guess there's another example, which is you can actually have the trill begin on the chord tone and go down. Right? This is how a trill is notated. You'll see a little trill symbol, a little italicized trill, or you'll see this little wiggly thing, right? Great. A mordent. Now, a mordent includes the written note, the note below the written note, which is the auxiliary tone, and a return to the written note. So if you see this, basically a squiggle with a line through it, you have a mordant, and it's basically you interpret the mordant as this. Right? Cool. A turn. A turn begins on an auxiliary tone a step above the written note, and then it steps back down to the main note, and then it steps below the main note to the auxiliary tone beneath it, and then it steps back up to the main note. So if you see this turn symbol, it's basically right? Sounds like a turn. So it's basically, okay, that's a turn. I thought we turned past this, but look at it again in all its misspelled glory. Appoggiatura. So, you know, I'd say Peihan made the comment of the day. I'm very pleased with Peihan's comment because I was restored faith in the appoggiatura to some degree, not completely, but I was restored faith in the appoggiatura that this characteristic of leaping down by step, no, leaping by skip, and then approach, moving the other direction by step, is still withheld in this example, although it's kind of hidden. These notes right here actually don't fit into this F dominant 7th chord. Only this note fits into the F dominant 7th chord. So you're actually leaping from a chord tone down to a non-chord tone, and you're stepping in the opposite direction. That actually fits the classic definition of an appoggiatura. All is well in the world, except for the appoggiatura in the ornamented or embellished sense. So the appoggiatura in the ornamented or embellished sense is this. You basically see a little, you know, in general, you can call these grace notes, I think, but I guess you can call them appoggiaturas. In this particular case, and I'll kind of explain that, if you see this symbol right here, it's an appoggiatura. And as I mentioned earlier, you can interpret it like this. You basically provide equal weighting to each of these notes, rhythmic weighting or rhythmic durations, or you can have the first one be a little shorter. These are two possible interpretations. Okay? So I guess in all examples of the appoggiatura, except for the ornamented case, the appoggiatura is approached by skip and left by step in the opposite direction. But in the ornamented case of the appoggiatura, you can have three notes moving in the same direction. Gosh, I'm seeing it everywhere now. See, part of me just thought that Microsoft wouldn't have a definition for this, so I was just like, nah, I'm right. But I guess Microsoft has definitions for everything. There's some researcher at Microsoft that's like putting in appoggiatura into the dictionary. Okay, another form of an ornament or embellished tone is a grace note. This is the grace note proper. And a grace note looks like an appoggiatura, but it has a slash through the stem. And the grace note is played quickly before the beat of the main note. And the grace note is probably called an accacciatura. It's also called an accacciatura. So it's like, so it happens before the beat. Okay, that's an accacciatura, a grace note. This is an appoggiatura. Right? I'm basically an appoggiatura, I'm actually playing this non-chord tone on the beat, really emphasizing it. Whereas in a grace note, I'm playing the non-chord tone right before the beat. Right? Versus the appoggiatura scenario is playing. Google Google says accaciatura. Thank you for finding the correct spelling. A-C-C-A-C-C-A. Oh my gosh. Oh, wait. A-C-C-I-A. If Microsoft has this definition, oh my gosh. I'm very impressed with Microsoft right now for having a definition, a word entry for accaciatura. Okay, so I know I said I was going to talk about the big and the small, but really I ended up talking a lot about the small today. I think it's an interesting world to explore, though. And it really comes in handy when you're actually analyzing real music. So for instance, in your homework, what I like about the examples I gave you is it's actually homework that deals with examples of real music, that includes real music. So you have to contextualize these terms in terms of the actual music itself. So someone says, accaciatura comes from accacciare, which means to crush, hence the small duration and on-beat appearance of the grace note. I guess it would be an off-beat appearance. Oh no, accaciatura would be right, yeah, right. But yeah, it's interesting, to crush. Connor gave a good definition of appoggiatura earlier too. I've got to assimilate this stuff. So anyway, this stuff might be a little confusing. It's predicated on actually doing harmonic analysis, right? So I tried to kind of lead you in the right direction by circling chords that you can kind of use to go against the chords. And I might have been a little too hand-holdy, but actually writing notes. But I was just worried that this would be a lot for you guys. So, and incidentally, I disagreed with this. This is where my first this is one of my first losses of faith in the author right here. Because I feel as though that this right here is the chord tone. They wanted you to treat this as a chromatic passing tone. But I felt like this was actually in the context of what we're actually doing. This is actually part of it's not this chord progression. I guess it could be. No, I think in the context of this, it's arguable. I mean, there's not enough information to really know. So I just called it a chord tone just to show you that it could be in that particular case. But if this were actually, let's see. No, I would totally argue that it's actually, I guess it could go both ways. This is like an ambiguous example, so I wanted to kind of put my 2 cents in there. Anyway, certain answers, I'll accept multiple answers within reason. Anyway, enjoy this homework assignment, and I will see you again. What day is it? It's Thursday. Okay, I'll see you again on Tuesday. Stick around for office hours if you need any help. And yeah, hopefully this was fun for you to explore. Thank you.